I'm from Meeting the Challenge Incorporated. We operate this DIVTAC project. We're called the ADA Center, but Meeting the Challenge is kind of a unique company. We're a small for-profit, but most of the work we do is a nonprofit grant for the Department of Education under this DIVTAC project. We are expanding our services somewhat, but this kind of tells you a little bit about what we are. I mean, we are, as a driving force in the company, about trying to make the world accessible for people with disabilities. And if we can make a living doing that, it's a good thing, but we try to at least break even. So I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about that. The ADA Center is funded by a grant from the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research, which is part of the Department of Education. And just as a disclaimer, anything I tell you is not legal advice. We do this to give informal guidance on the Americans with Disabilities Act, and we do, of course, inform people on other disabilities rights laws. But the Department of Ed kind of reins us in, and anything I tell you has no bearing on any enforcement agency of the United States government. Before I go into the presentation today, as Ian said, we would like to do potentially a couple more, maybe certainly one on public rights of way. This session is going to cover very much rec facilities, and as I get into it, you'll find out I'm not even going to cover all kinds of rec facilities that are covered in Chapter 10 of the new standards, but I think the ones that would be more critical to you as landscape architects. We believe, and I'm basing this on the word of Lois Tebow at the United States Access Board. Last summer she said they were almost certain that the public rights of way guidelines were going to be adopted and become standards this year, which will make life easier for you, for me, for public entities all over the country who have responsibilities for public rights of way. So when we get a little more on that, I mean, I'd like to do a presentation on best practices. I think that would be helpful to you, but it would be really great to have force of law behind those so that we can really tell you a little bit more. And that's really what this session is about. These guidelines, a lot of what's in here has been available, and all of these documents, by the way, are on CD-ROMs. If you didn't get one of our CD-ROMs out at the front table, make sure you get one before you leave, and we can make more copies if we need to. But the Access Board did on golf and swimming pools, boating facilities, fishing piers, accessible play areas. They've done all this stuff that was guidance. In federal government terminology, guidelines are best practices, they're good ideas, they're recommendations, but nobody can enforce them. Once they're adopted by enforcing agencies, they become standards. And once they're standards, then they can be enforced. And in September, the Department of Justice adopted the new 2010 ADA standards. And at that point, the recreation guidelines became enforceable. Enforceable has a timeline, and we'll get into that as we go into this. And for what it's worth, all the regulations and the commentary that supports this presentation is like about a 50-page printout, and all of this comes out of the ADA standards, which there is no print version of that document available yet. The Department of Justice just officially produced their printable version of that recently, and we're kind of going through a process of getting to the point where we will be producing copies and distributing them to everybody, and they'll probably sell for about what it costs to produce a copy, and it's 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch thick, so it'll probably be $10 a copy or something. And we will advise you, you're on our list, I'll assume that you would like to have a copy of that when they become available. By the way, Kent Kelly is our new Director of Consulting Services, and I dragged him along today because I figured he should have to sit through at least one of my trainings at some point in time and see what I actually do sometimes. Okay, so as I said, these standards have been adopted. The law, the ADA, requires the Department of Justice to adopt standards for architectural accessibility. Most of what is in the old ADAG, as we refer to it, deals with really buildings, facilities, a little bit of site stuff, and there's very, very much not a lot we can point to once you get beyond the edges of buildings in terms of what needs to be done. But when they adopted these, one of the points was they adopted the 2004 ADAG, which was the guidelines developed by the Access Board at that point in time, and it took them until 6 years later to actually make those force of law. Part of that process is that they were trying to harmonize the ADA standards with building codes and try and get to where we're almost at the point where at least the ADA standards sort of agree with the 2003 ANSI standards now, and so 10 years from now we'll be caught up with the 2010 ANSI standards or something. These are requirements that will not have safe harbor. Going forward, if an entity builds something right now until March 15th of next year, if they build it according to the old ADAG, it will have safe harbor. But there are no specifications in the old ADAG for these recreation facilities, so those things will not have safe harbor, meaning that Title II entities will not be able to say, well, we built this according to the standards, and there were no standards, so this swimming pool that's not accessible is okay. No, it will not be okay. If a private entity has any of these aspects, like a private golf course or something, if they say, well, at the time we built this, there were no standards, and they built it this year, they will be required to do readily achievable barrier removal to come into compliance. We are highly recommending to anybody that's designing anything today to look at the new standards and to think going forward how much confusion they may save by using the current standards instead of having to look back and figure out when changes were made and so on and so forth. There are 10 different areas covered in Chapter 10. I am not going to cover here for you amusement rides or exercise machines or miniature golf or saunas and steam rooms or shooting facilities and firing positions. We will discuss boating facilities, piers and platforms, golf facilities, play areas, and swimming pools. I'm not going to cover all the exceptions. For every rule in this, there's probably, on average, about 3 different exceptions. We will talk about some of those. I know that you guys are doing site work, and I really don't know all the time where the limits of what you're doing are going to be. So if I get to a point where you feel like TMI, if I'm telling you about stuff that you don't want to know, raise your hand and say, this isn't something we do, and we'll go on to the next thing. I think that probably, golf courses and play areas are going to have more things that you're interested in, but all of this has probably got some application in terms of how you would advise your clients. So, recreational boating facilities. The main thing we talk about in the ADA is usually like, okay, when something exists, then it needs to be accessible, or at least some part of it needs to be accessible. So if you're dealing with a recreational boating facility, a certain part of that is going to have to be accessible, minimum number, and if there are various types of facilities, then they'll have to type the number that are accessible will have to be dispersed amongst the different types of facilities that you offer. And if you've got launch ramps, at least one, but 5% should be accessible. You will notice I've got a lot of, brought my pointer with me. I've got a lot of embedded links here, but I can't seem to get internet access. This presentation is on CD-ROM, and so you can go to where the regulations, the regulatory language is on any of these things where I've embedded that. But anyway, gangways that are part of required accessible routes must be accessible, and there are some exceptions to this. Okay. In general, this 40 foot of slip edge, there should be an accessible boat area. There should be a minimum of 1. There's a whole table that explains this. It's kind of like when you look at requirements for number of accessible parking spaces or whatever. So if you get up to a huge marina and there's over 1,000, you need at least 12 accessible spaces plus one for every 100 or fraction thereof after that. Dispersion, accessible boat slips shall be dispersed throughout various types. So the things that they look at is, like if you've got single or double berths, if there's accommodations available like electricity and other features that are available at boat slip, and some are, so to speak, deluxe boat slips, and some are average, and some are, economy, then you have to disperse the slips amongst the variety there. Boat slip clearance, each 10 foot of linear pier edge should have basically half of it accessible. You can have edge protection at those spaces, 4 inches high and 2 inches thick, so basically like a 2x4. And this kind of gives you a demonstration of how those spaces will be lined out on a pier. And that shows you the edge design, not the clearest graphic I've ever pulled up. At launch ramps, where they're provided at least 5%, but no less than 1, should be accessible. The routes serving boarding piers must be accessible routes, and that's all explained in Chapter 4 of the standards, which is why I put a link there. And there are exceptions to that. Some of those exceptions have to do with building code allowances. Basically, you're looking at there should be a 60-inch wide space on the edge of a pier or launch ramp. Gangways have very, think about the application of gangways. You've got a ramp that leads to a floating pier, and that pier can float, at various different levels. I always think of driving by Blue Mesa Reservoir, and from one year to the next, depending on whether we're having a good rain or a good snow year or a bad year, the level of water changes dramatically. So there are some realistic limitations on what has to be done in terms of gangways approaching floating piers. There is no exception to the accessible route requirements where the accessible route connects fixed piers to land or other fixed structures. So, for example, this area here, this is a fixed structure. This is almost too steep to me. I mean, theoretically, you shouldn't have to, you're not required to make a gangway longer than 80 feet. This one, if this is 80 feet long, there's, depending, you can see this might float up to here, or maybe even lower than where it's at here. This part would not be required to be 1 to 12. This part up here would be, and in fact, if this ramp is longer than 30 feet, it should have a landing every 30 feet, and there shouldn't be more than basically 30 inches of vertical between landings. Okay, any questions? You guys do work on rec boating facilities once in a while? Fishing piers and platforms, pretty similar. The issue here is handrails that should not be too high for somebody to be able to fish over the top of. And at least 25% shouldn't be higher than 34 inches. There should be clear space for somebody to be able to pull a wheelchair up to the edge of a platform to be able to fish. There's a couple of different ways this can be done. It can be basically you can provide that clear space inside the railing, or you can do it where you have like an underlap and an extension of the deck underneath the railing by a minimum of 12 inches.
So Jeff, in those instances, as long as it's a designated fishing pier, we can go below the 42 inch.
Yeah, and this is what this is. Yeah, this is we're a guard complying with sections of the IBC. This is incorporated by reference in Chapter 1 of the new ADA standards, and it explains essentially what you're doing if you're complying with, or where you can make exceptions to compliance with the IBC. And so it's pretty well. I'm going to assume that you guys know more about IBC or ANSI in that respect than I do. And so basically where 42 inches is allowed, you could probably do that. Okay. Same thing as with boating facilities in terms of where you put slips. If you've got railings on a fishing pier, they should be, the lowered railings should be dispersed to accommodate different areas of fishing, so that, you know, if all the good fishing spots are out at the end of the pier, or all the good fishing spots are right in close to shore, those should not be limited to accessible or inaccessible. They should be dispersed somewhat evenly. And that, so you're looking at issues like water depth, shade, you know, time of day with the sun and all that kind of thing.
Who decides that?
Well,
Who decides what the good fishing spot?
well, if you're dispersing the spots evenly around, the pier, then hopefully you get some spots in equal places. I mean, obviously, fishing from a pier, there's going to be certain limitations on that. But I mean, if you put all of the accessible places out at the end of the pier, or all of them close into shore, then that would be dispersed.
And the need for the railing kicks in at the 30-inch height above the bottom of the lake.
30-inch. The requirement to have a railing,
Half a railing.
that's a, you know, and that's a, I should just briefly state this. That is probably the building code requirement. The ADA doesn't require you to put a railing. The ADA requires if you put a railing, that some of them be accessible. And this is kind of big picture step back for a second. The ADA is a civil rights law. It's not a building code. Now, the new standards look much more like a building code, and they're much more harmonized than they used to be. But the ADA always looks at things in terms of integration, in terms of equal access. A classic example of this, the ADA doesn't require that there's public transportation. It only says that where public transportation exists, it must be non-discriminatory toward people with disabilities. So if you go up to, say, Weld County's got 2 vans that cover like 5,000 square miles, and they bring people to Denver like 1 day a week for medical appointments and so on and so forth. And that van service serves people with disabilities, it serves seniors, it serves everyday members of the community. And there are complaints about long times on the buses, appointments that the driver shows up late for, just generally poor service. And people with disabilities will say, well, I want to complain, this is discrimination. And I will say, no, that is not discrimination, because everybody's getting the same poor level of service. So, you really have to think in terms of, the ADA says equal access. So in terms of these piers, yeah, if the law says you got to have a railing there, then at that point in time, the ADA is going to say some of the railings got to be accessible to people.
And a follow-up to that, on the,
Okay. Bug me if you think what it is. Okay. Edge protection, where accessible railings, guards, or handrails are provided, edge protection, curb barrier, or extended deck surface shall be provided. The curb inch, 2 inches minimum above the surface of the pier. The extended deck can go out 12 inches under the railing. There should be toe clearance at extension that's 9 inches is what we consider foot clearance on a wheelchair. So you should have at least the bottom of the railing should be 9 inches high, and the space to go through that should be at least 30 inches wide. The basic dimension that we always use in terms of wheelchair access is we say wheelchair has a 30-inch by 48-inch footprint. And there it is. And that will be referred to as clear floor or ground space. So when that's required in various different instances, that's what we're talking about, and that's spelled out in Chapter 3 of the standards. And where there are no railings, at least one clear floor or ground space shall be provided on the fishing pier. There should be a turning space. Turning spaces are either a 60-inch diameter or a T configuration like this. All right?
Do these standards, ADA standards for these facilities apply just to publicly accessible, privately and publicly owned, or do they apply to individual residences that are standalone?
Just public. The ADA covers, Title I is employment for anybody with 15 or more employees or public entities with any employees. Title II of the ADA covers state and local governments. Title III of the ADA covers places of public accommodation, which are private businesses. Okay, so no, for residential, if there's no public access, and as an example, if you say have a residential community, like condos or something that are they have private access to a facility or something, then there probably needs to be accessible route to things, but then the standards as far as the actual part of it, those would not cover that as a public accommodation. Any other code questions?
Even if there's a resident, so you have an apartment complex, pool, you have a resident.
What happens in those situations is, okay, common areas should be accessible up to a point. Actually, the Fair Housing Act covers the residential thing, and what it really says, like for instance about pools, is you need to provide an accessible route to the pool, but does not require an accessible entrance into the pool. Now, if you have a tenant in, for instance, and this gets into these real legal arguments between HOAs and tenants a lot of times, is that basically under the Fair Housing Act, I don't like to declare this to the nth degree, but generally what they would say is if you're a tenant and you live someplace, even if you own it or you rent it, and it's multiple unit housing, and you need to do something to make your facility, your space accessible, or to have access to features that are part of that space, then at your own expense you can have those changes made, and typically an HOA cannot deny you being able to do that. There have been quite a few fights over that, to be honest. In terms of rental housing, like in an apartment complex, FHA definitely protects a tenant in those circumstances. Now, if they make alterations to make the facility accessible that would not be desirable to the next tenant, then they also have to pay to fix those things. If it's something in a common area of like rental housing, public housing, there's a point at which it depends on whether it's private landlord or public landlord, if there's any federal money like Section 8 or something, and it gets a little bit, I could spend a whole day talking about that. But yeah, there's, generally speaking, private facilities are not going to, private clubs are not going to have to go along with any of this. So when I'm talking about golf facilities, I'm talking about publicly owned courses like, Littleton Parks and Rec District, or a private club that's open to the public that you don't have to have a membership or whatever. And membership, private club membership under the ADA it's not like you pay $20 a year to be a member of something just so that they can say they're a private club. Usually there's a fairly substantial hurdle of membership, like you need to be recommended by other members, and the cost of membership is substantial in order for something to amount to being a private club. And golf courses are probably one of the few places that can demonstrably say that they do have a private membership. Okay. Newly constructed and altered golf facilities must have either an accessible route or a golf cart passage. This is probably the most significant part of these regulations. Basically, areas within the boundaries of a golf course need to be accessible by golf cart passages. They do not need to be accessible. They do not have to have accessible routes. This is, essentially when you get down to it, you figure out the topography of a golf course. It would probably be a fundamental alteration of a golf course to have accessible routes with nothing exceeding 1 to 12 slopes and so on and so forth, no cross slopes, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, somebody using a golf car can travel on paths that might have slopes that are in excess of what an accessible route would be. So basically, within the boundaries and outside the boundaries of the golf course, there can be golf car passages to access areas such as your teeing areas where you would golf car rental, bag drop off, and other elements. And if there's like weather shelters on the course, if there's teeing grounds, at least there must be at least one accessible per hole. At least 5%, but no less than one practice teeing ground, practice teeing stations or driving ranges and putting greens must be accessible. Basically, a golf cart can enter and exit. The accessible routes issue, serving teeing grounds, et cetera, those need to be 48 inches wide to allow a golf cart. Where handrails are provided, accessible routes need to be 60 inches wide. But there's also an exception. You don't have to put handrails on. So for instance, if you had an accessible route and had a ramp on it, you have to put hand railings. If you 6 inches, you rise more than 6 inches, then you've got to put handrails. On a golf course, you might have a route up the side of a hill that's way steeper than that, but it's a golf cart passage. You don't have to put hand railings on it. It's just that if you do, then you have to have 60-inch minimum width. I think I talked about this. The 48 inch is basically to allow golf cars passage. Regularly an accessible route is 36 inches wide. So that you need to connect any area that somebody would travel to on a golf course in a golf car. Probably has to have a golf car passage as opposed to just a regular accessible route. But you can't use a golf car passage to substitute for other required accessible routes. So if your golf course has got a parking lot out here and the clubhouse is over here and there's a restaurant and a variety of different amenities, anything that you would, a public restroom or something that's adjacent to the parking area, you have to have accessible routes to those that don't exceed the 1 to 12, that have firm, stable, slip-resistant surfaces, et cetera, et cetera. So those areas do still have to have an accessible route, not just a golf cart passage.
Do the routes need to be paved or crusher fines?
They do not necessarily have to be paved. I get this question a lot about parking lots, for instance. Like, does a parking lot have to be paved in order for spaces to be accessible? Technically, no. It's very hard to maintain a surface as firm and stable, let alone slip-resistant outdoors without paving it, but conceivably it's possible. I could do a 2-hour presentation on surface treatments in parks and recreation areas that are contingent on different climates and weather and so on and so forth. There's the National Center on Accessibility in Indiana, which is a joint venture between the National Park Service and University of Indiana. They've done studies and they've worked on outdoor paths and figured out that in some places you can use like crusher fines, and if you compact them, you don't get enough rain that they're going to be a problem. Other places you try to do that, if you've got a lot of rainfall, crusher fines are basically just going to erode away in no time at all. So there is a little bit of latitude there. But the one thing I always emphasize is that anything that's made accessible for the ADA has to be maintained as accessible. Making something accessible at the point it's built, we'll get into this with the surfaces in play areas. If at the time it's built it meets all the requirements, but 6 months later it doesn't, then somebody still has to do something about it.
Quick question.
Yes.
I think this question applies to any one of your topics, but if you have a budget set aside to do golf course improvements for playability, golf, sand traps, whatever. So you're making any modification to that facility. But you know that you might have an access issue to the driving range. Does this mean that you have to reassess your priorities to do that?
I would say that under the 20% disproportionality regulation, which applies both to private and public entities, the answer is yes. Basically, the answer is yes. So in other words, if say that you're doing modifications to primary use areas of a facility and you're going to spend $100,000 to do that, and you didn't take into account in none of that $100,000 were you doing anything to improve access, then theoretically you have an obligation to spend another $20,000 specifically to make those primary use areas accessible. To give you an example of that that's fairly common, if you were redesigning, doing a major remodel in a building, and one of the things that would be required to make the building completely accessible would be to put an elevator in it. If you were doing $1 million project, that elevator is probably going to be within that 20%. If you're doing a $100,000 project, probably not. So there are limits. I mean, the point of disproportionality is, in terms of Title III entities, is not to make things beyond the point of readily achievable. And for Title II entities, basically Congress did not want every city and county and local government to have to spend a lot of money to retrofit every facility they have. Okay, so we've covered this. Golf cart passages should be 48 inches wide. This is a place where we sort of step outside of the typical dimensionality of the ADA. The typical dimensionality of the ADA sort of focuses on anthropometrics and wheelchair dimensions, but golf cars are bigger. Where there's curbs or constructed barriers along routes to prevent golf cars from entering the fairway, there have to be openings for access 60 inches wide, at least every 75 yards. If you've got weather shelters, they should have clear floor or ground space 60 inches by 96 inches minimum. So this is demonstrating where you've got to have these gaps and any curbing that would allow somebody to enter that area in their golf cart. Teeing grounds. If you have just one, then it needs to be accessible. If you have two, then the forward one should be accessible. If you have three or more, at least two of them should be accessible, including the forward one. So you get teeing stations, same thing. Some of them have to be accessible. Greens, shelters, practice facilities. Putting greens should be designed and constructed so that a golf cart can enter and exit. This is an area, I don't play golf, so my access to golf courses has been back in college cross country. We used to once in a while get to run on somebody's fairways, and I could tell they didn't like that for us to be there anyway. But there's been a lot of argument about whether a golf car coming onto or an accessible, some of the single-user small units that people actually golf from, whether those can travel on a green without doing damage to it. If it's the right equipment, most of the studies will substantiate that the pressure per square inch by the wide tires on these vehicles is actually probably going to do less damage and have less torque on the surface than somebody standing there in golf spikes. But you will still find golf courses that kind of say, we just don't want any kind of a vehicle on our green, and so far the law says, but you will let them there. So that's kind of the issue there. Where you have weather shelters, some should be accessible. At least 5%, not less than one, practice putting greens, teeing grounds, teeing stations, driving ranges should be designed and constructed so that a golf cart can enter and exit. So The weather shelter obviously needs to be big enough that you can pull a cart into it. The 60-inch width, I'm not sure if you can actually get 2 in there at once. It's, you might be able to fit 2 end to end. Any other questions on the golf course before we?
On the teen station, your drawing kind of alludes to that being a driving range, so we're talking about teen stations per hole.
We're talking, team grounds have holes, the 1 and 3 thing. If you've got 3, then at least 2 need to be accessible, and the forward 1 needs to be accessible. At driving ranges, then I believe it's a percentage of the total number of teeing spaces would need to be.
Okay, thanks.
All right, play areas. I don't know if you can tell this. We recently did a project in the city of Alamosa and looked at all of their parks. Maybe I shouldn't say that because, you know, this is probably evidence against them or something. This would fit accessibility in terms of a component, but all of this is like loose gravel and sand down here. I always think of this story when we start talking about play areas of one of our colleagues who's the director of the center in Missouri. He uses a wheelchair. He talks about being on a playground with his daughter hanging on these monkey bars and starting to fall. And he was in a wheelchair and he couldn't get to her. And how he felt frustrated and basically impotent to deal with that situation. So the access to the equipment is like really, really important, and it's not just for the children who use it, it's possibly for their parents or grandparents or whoever happens to be at the park with them. Play areas designed, constructed, and altered for children ages 2 and over in a variety of settings, including parks, schools, child care facilities, and shopping centers are covered. Basically, there are elevated and ground components, and a percentage of each of those need to be accessible. They need to be on accessible routes. Ramps and transfer systems need to allow, access for multiple component units. There's platforms and transfer steps. They must have accessible ground surfaces. Where separate play areas are provided within a site for specific age groups, each area should meet requirements. Where play areas are designed and constructed in phases, scoping requirements should apply to each successive addition so that when the addition is completed, the entire area complies with applicable requirements. This is kind of the push here is to make sure that, as you expand a facility, that it doesn't lose sight, and that, or that you don't say that, well, later on we're going to add the accessible stuff. It should be staged in accessible. I really wish that I could make this link work. There's some great pictures. The whole document that this came from is on the CD-ROM. But basically, what they're talking about here is you have an entrance level here, a transfer platform. These steps are not more than 8 inches high. This is an elevated play component. You don't necessarily have to have the same kind of access to a slide. You can get between these different components and enjoy all the different areas of this play device. And there's another area you can access it. That's kind of what the intent is that anybody can use this composite device. Where ground level play components are provided, at least one of each type shall be on an accessible route. And it should have a turning space, it should have clear floor or ground space, and that clear floor or ground space obviously needs to be an accessible surface. If you have play tables, they should have a 24-inch high, 17-inch deep, and 30-inch wide minimum, and any obstruction shouldn't be higher than 31 inches. Points of entry, and And this, by the way, in the standards, it says from, but what they mean is above. And it was really confusing to me because usually when they say from, they're talking about horizontal distance. But anyway, these points of access, and this can be kind of age-related depending on what the intent of a facility is. So that's why this 11-inch low to 24-inch high, typically, I believe 18 inches is the preferred height that serves the most people, most children. Anyway, where play components are required, require transfer of entry points receipts, at least one means of support. They should have some way that they can pull themselves, either rope loops or loop-type handles, D-grips, things like that, to be able to pull somebody onto those units rather than pull themselves. Bear in mind that the intent of the ADA is for people, including children with disabilities, as much as possible to have independent access. So this shows where the point of entry is on this device. And so this level here should be 11 to 18 inches. And there's devices like this that might get a little bit more. And with the accessible surface leading over to it. Where large play areas include 2 or more composite play structures designed for the same age group, the total number of elevated play components on all the composite play structures must be added to determine the additional number and types of ground level play components that must be provided on an accessible route. So basically, when you look at a facility, you have to count the number of elements in each of the composite units to figure out what the scoping is, how many of the ground level units need to be on an accessible route. And that ratio is explained in table 240.2.1.2, which goes into this whole thing of, how many elevated, how many ground level, and how many need to be accessible. Where elevated components are provided, at least 50% accessible and on an accessible route. The clear width of accessible routes connecting elevated components shall be 36 inches minimum. The rise for any ramp connecting elevated components should be 12-inch maximum. So if you've got ramps interconnecting, they should be not longer than a 12-foot ramp, preferably, they should be not less than a 12-foot ramp with not more than a 12-inch rise. Preferably, they would not be that steep, so you might need a longer ramp to make it more accessible. Where required on ramps serving play components, handrails shall be accessible. Handrails are not required on most areas of play components, but they are required in some places. They're not required on ramps located within ground level use zones. Handrail extensions are, the loops at the end of the railings, like you see, are not required. Typically, the gripping surfaces should be 20 to 28 inches high, so lower than what's used for wheelchair ramp. Okay, accessible ground surfaces. They are required on accessible routes, clear floor spaces, and turning spaces. There is an ASTM standard, and that's referenced in Chapter 1. There's been a lot of research done on shock absorption values versus ability to roll across the surface. And one of the things that's really emphasized in the standards is there is a requirement to inspect and maintain these surfaces. There's probably not a real easy way, depending on weather and a bunch of other variables. I mean, if you've got, one would hope that you wouldn't have expansive soils or something under a surface like this, but you really have to sort of deal with it in terms of the actual conditions where you build it. But the point is, in the long haul, it might be less costly to build to do your your base underneath your surface to achieve a certain amount of resiliency and consistency, as opposed to not dealing with that in the first place and then having to consistently spend a lot of money on maintaining it. But that said, you know, if you build a park in a city park, you build a playground, the city is going to have an ongoing responsibility to maintain the ground surface according to specifications.
Jim, on the ground surface stuff, if we have to meet fall height criteria for the kids in the playground equipment, then we've got to meet ADA criteria for accessibility, and then you're talking about equitable access to all the components. Really, we're going entirely to rubber tile or core-based rubber, but we're rubberizing the surfaces of all playgrounds. Like wood mold's really isn't going to float except in outer areas. Maybe.
Right. Yeah, and I think that you can have sort of a variety of different surfaces within, ground surfaces, as long as the accessible routes and the clear ground spaces where you would access components have accessible surfaces. But yeah, certainly it's going to be really hard with any kind of a wood material to come up with a surface that's going to be consistent. And I can't imagine much besides, like rubber tiles that is going to be consistently, and there again, the base that you put under it is going to make a lot of difference in that too. Okay, you can use, get to one.
We can run right in.
Okay. You can use ramps or transfer systems to connect and to get to different components in a unit. They're preferred over transfer systems. Not all children who use wheelchairs or other mobility devices may be able to use or may choose not to use transfer systems. They would just as soon stay in their chair. That's another kind of defining principle of the ADA, that for someone who uses a wheelchair, that is part of their person, and requiring a person to leave their chair behind should be sort of the last resort in terms of accessibility. I'll go to transportation again as an example. We could say, well, look, just pull your wheelchair over here to the side of the bus and we'll pick you up and carry you on and throw you in one of the seats and we'll put your wheelchair in a rack. That's number one, not very dignified, and number two, not very independent, and number three, it's completely against the law to do that. So that's where you kind of want to look at things, and if you can figure out a way for people to access something without having to leave the wheelchair, that's certainly a preferred course of action. Once again, the 12-inch limit on rise, and where possible, keep the slope of any of those ramps less than 1 to 12. You can use berms or sculpted dirt to provide elevation and make those parts of accessible routes. So you can ramp something to a surface, and by just building up the site, that's a way of doing it. Transfer platforms, they're supposed to be 14 inches deep, 24 inches wide. The height should be between 11 and 18 inches. I believe that 18 is generally preferred, but if you were dealing with a playground for preschoolers, 18 inches might be too high. You should have transfer space adjacent to the platform. You should have a means of support for the transferring. This kind of generally shows this. So this height here should be pretty close to the wheelchair height, the seat height, and that's probably in the 18-inch range, but if you have children using smaller wheelchairs, maybe that should be lower. The transfer platform, this dimension 14, 24 inches wide. Transfer steps should be provided where movement is intended from transfer platforms to levels with elevated play components required to be on accessible routes. They should have that 14 by 24, and maximum height of these steps should be 8 inches. Obviously, the point of exercise playground equipment is to provide exercise for children, so it's one thing to provide them with steps that they can manage and do get exercise climbing up. It's another thing to make those steps so high that they're impassable.
You know, Jeff, you brought up a good point about the transfer stations, because I, we've done a number of playgrounds and I'm friends with, good friends with some folks that have a girl in a wheelchair. And, she really let me have it when she went out to one of our playgrounds where we had a ramp that went out to play equipment, and then you had to go upstairs to get any of the play events. But, I mean, she said, and she hangs around with a lot of people in wheelchairs, she said, the kids never use the transfer stations and crawl around on the stairs. I mean, first of all, they're probably going to get stepped on from the other kids running around. So, I mean, if at all possible, if you could ramp up to the, like, the top of that slide, that first picture you had on.
Yeah.
I mean, that's going to get used more, because they will go down, and then somebody will bring the chair back over the bottom of the slide. But, I mean, very rarely are those transfer stations ever used by wheelchairs.
Exactly. Thank you.
And on the other side of that, 15 years ago, when we was really when we were asking about playground design, we had a lot of discussions about dangers that were created on play equipment by having wheelchairs and elevated platforms and other types of things where they had the swing ramps and put the metal plates where you roll your swing, the wheelchair onto it, clip it in, and then swing. And when, if there wasn't a wheelchair on it, other kids would be pushing these metal plates back and forth, and it would cut you off at the knees.
Yeah.
So some other dangerous conditions.
Yeah, and certainly, you have to keep safety in mind. Makes me think about one of my colleagues, Rob Gilderson, who does a lot of architectural stuff, uses a wheelchair. Speaking of playgrounds, we went up to the Breckenridge Outdoor Education Center, and they have a ropes course up there. And we have a picture of him. I took this picture of him going across a bridge on this ropes course, and his tires on his wheelchair were actually leveraged against the sides of the slats on this bridge as he went across it. He had a harness on. He couldn't fall. He likes to take risks. Okay. Let's see. All accessible play components where more than one must be integrated and dispersed. We've said this before, dispersed. We have to, spread these things around. You don't have like a corner of the playground where all the accessible equipment is. Children with disabilities should be able to play with other children, particularly, their siblings or something. Any other questions about, yes?
Yeah, so when you have like a port-in-place rubber surface, what is your maximum slopes? Because there's no direct route of travel. You're going all over the place, so what kind of slopes?
I would say that you want to probably stay in the 1 to 48 slopes up to certain, to the accessible route to where you would ramp onto a device or where you would get to an entry point or a transfer station. In terms of underneath everything, I don't think that you have to pay as much attention to it there. I think that my reading of the standards is that you don't want to get to the point where you fundamentally alter the idea of a playground and the experience. You do want to make the equipment accessible. I'm trying to picture where you would typically put playground equipment. I suppose it could be on a side slope of a hill or something like that, and you might have some issues. And you certainly wouldn't have to grade your site to make it flat, but you might have to grade some access areas. Okay. We're talking about getting 2 swimming pools. I don't know how much you guys deal with advising your clients in terms of actual transfer walls, lifts, and stuff like that. But I can tell you, since the law was adopted, these standards were adopted, we're getting tons of questions from lift providers about whose arm they can twist to make them buy a lift. So I imagine at some point, if you're dealing with any community facilities that have pools in them, you may have some of these questions come up. But generally speaking, the big difference here, I mean, even going back to the Fair Housing Act, there's been a requirement to provide access to swimming pools, which normally means an accessible route within a facility or a park or whatever, so that somebody can get to the swimming pool. But there has never been an enforceable standard that said you must provide a means of getting in and out of the pool. A lot of pools have put this equipment in over the years, but that's been best practices. It has not been an ADA requirement. In some cases, I believe that the ANSI standards have made it part of the building code, but that doesn't necessarily cover all applications. And this will only cover, as we said before, we were talking about private, public, and publicly open private versus like a private club, or say, for instance, a swimming pool at an apartment complex is going to be covered by FHA. These standards do not apply to that swimming pool. A swimming pool, unless they allow the public, the general public, to access that pool. If it's a private use for tenants, residents, and their friends and guests, then it's not covered by this. Okay, so, and this is, I kind of thought this might be of interest to you guys, that wave action pools, leisure rivers, sand bottom pools, where user access is limited to one area, are not required to have more than one accessible means. So, like you could have a beach area, I suppose, that's, would qualify for this, and, you don't really have to look at that like you would look at a swimming pool. Okay, swimming pools are required if they have 300 feet or more of linear wall to have two means of access. They should be two different means, a transfer station or a transfer wall, or a sloped entrance or a lift or whatever. They've got to have two different ways, and they should be in two different locations. Wading pools are supposed to have one minimum, and it should be sloped. Spas should have one minimum, and it should be a lift, transfer wall, or a transfer system. Pool lifts should be located where the water is not deeper than 48 inches. If you have, for instance, say a lap pool that's 60 inches deep everywhere, I think that you still have to put a lift to get into the pool, and basically you would waive that. In terms of your deck surface between the seat and the edge of the pool, you should have a flat deck, 1 to 48. On the side of the seat away from the water, there should be a clear deck space, same 48 by 30 dimension. Actually, when you've got a transfer wall, you kind of need a recessed area that's got a 60 by 60 so somebody can turn around. And that deck space actually should be 36 inches wide and should extend 48 inches from a line located 12 inches behind the rear edge of the seat. I think I've got it. So this dimension here is kind of like shower stalls that are accessible. You have to be able to back up your wheelchair to this point here so that you can transfer there. And that's the point of that. Main things with these, they need to be independently accessible from in the water and from the side of the pool. So if the seat is in the up position and somebody wants to get out of the water, there has to be a way for them to, in the water, push a button to bring it back down to level. If it's in the water and they come up to it, they should need a lifeguard or somebody to come over and get it out of the water for them. Okay. Seat height, kind of like we measure other things, 16 to 19 inches, 16 inches wide, capable of unassisted operation, and designed so the seat can go at least 18 inches minimum depth into the water, and it should handle a capacity of 300 pounds. Sloped entries are not required to have slip-resistant surfaces. Should extend to a depth of 24 inches minimum and 30 inches maximum below stationary water level. Should be 2 accessible handrails. The clear width between those handrails should be 33 to 38 inches, except for wave pools, leisure rivers, and sand bottoms. This demonstrates that sloped entry approach. This is the transfer wall where you've got an area below water level on the outside. You can have 1 grab bar or 2 grab bars for these. That, I think they call it width, but the thickness of that wall should be 12 to 16 inches. And the area the length of that needs to be clear deck space 8 inches along that wall. Transfer systems, these are like sort of stepped areas. There needs to be a 60 by 60 space that's flat, centered along the 24-inch side of the platform. And then once again, 16 to 19-inch height. Transfer steps like we saw in playground equipment, 8 inches maximum height. Basically, it needs to go to a depth 18 inches minimum below the stationary water level. Should be no sharp or pointed edges on that. Each step shall have a 14 to 17 inch tread clear and 24 inches width. At least one grab bar on each step or a continuous rail. And that should be 4 to 6 inches above. So you either do it like this or one like that. Pool stairs should be accessible. Step riser heights 4 to 7 inches. Should be they can be uniform. They must be uniform, I think. And the width 20 to 24 inches between the handrails. So these need to be closer than what you would have. So if somebody's using a step entrance, it's not like somebody using a wheelchair where they need to be able to handle the handrails from a wheelchair. These need to be closer together, sort of like parallel bars. This is a point I wanted to make, is that there is an exception for gates and doors. The new standards say that the highest level you can have any kind of control mechanism is 48 inches, but for swimming pool gates, for safety reasons, so children can't, small children can't open the gate by themselves, they do allow the 54-inch maximum on that. Almost. Yes?
You refer to altering something. Kind of what's the line, and what would be required if you did alter something to some degree?
Okay. An alteration generally means changing the usability of a primary use area, or not necessarily the usability, but features that affect the usability. So for instance, like it's easier to explain this in a building, but if you came in here and remodeled all the walls, you did something to change the walls in this room, painted them or put up a new facade, that probably does not affect accessibility at all. On the other hand, if you started moving walls or you were going to change the way doors came into this space, that type of an alteration would definitely be one that's going to call out accessibility issues. For what it's worth, the in outdoor areas, I would say like playground, if you were going to install new equipment, or if you were building, I would say like at a swimming pool, if you were building a new bathhouse or dressing facilities or something like that, or doing a significant remodel to that, I would say that's going to call into play any access issues that you have at that point in time up to the 20% disproportionality. Does that answer your question, or?
What about specifically to the pool, if you're going to alter something on the pool itself and the pool deck?
Okay, if you were, remodeling the pool deck, I mean, changing that, or, tearing out and pouring new concrete for a deck or something,
Yeah.
I would definitely think that would make a difference. If you were, changing out the water filtration system, as an example, that's probably not going to call it up. If you're doing plumbing or electrical changes like that, probably wouldn't make a difference. That would not be an alteration as far as the ADA was concerned. Okay. Yes.
When does the concept of a remote facility come into play? For example, say U.S. Fish and Wildlife area, a little parking lot, they're going to put in a ADA accessible fishing pier, but the route to the pier, to the parking lot is pretty much impossible to be ADA accessible.
First of all, if you're talking like federal property like national parks, they do have some recreation guidelines which are above and beyond this stuff. But in general terms, the path of travel to an area like that, we would tend to look at it in terms of fundamental alteration. The standards that I'm familiar with, and these are not ADA standards at this point, say that if you come to an obstruction that's a natural obstruction of a path that would, short of a fundamental alteration like using dynamite to move a rock or something, at that point in time, the path of travel is no longer accessible to somebody in a wheelchair. Then beyond that point, you do not have to provide an accessible path. Now, in terms of the actual, like you've got the fishing pier out there, I really would have to get back to you on that and say whether or not. Typically, what's been said is in facilities, like if you have a second story of a building that doesn't have a requirement to have an elevator, and it's a new building or you're doing alterations, any of the toilet rooms on the second floor should be accessible. Because if later on you put an elevator in that building, you should be able to access the features and elements of that floor. Now, if you're talking about a trail that leads, up the side of Pikes Peak back to the back side where there's a fishing pond, and you've got a pier there, and there's no way that you can conceive of there being an accessible route to that, I would probably argue that there's not a standard for that, but I'd really have to get back to you because it's not covered by these standards. I'll tell you that.
I've seen some sort of trail standards that have an allowance for steeper slopes,
Yeah.
for short distances, and maybe that's from the National Park
Yeah,
Service.
that is for the National Park Service, and those standards were developed by the National Center on Accessibility in Indiana. And yeah, they do sort of say you can go to a certain level of steepness, and you should continue to make, as long as you can make it within those standards up to a certain point. But if you reach a point where the trails, say for instance, I'm picturing someplace like down there in the Badlands of Utah where you've got these rock trails that lead back in there where people have rocks fall on them and water comes rushing down, and fun place to be. You might have a place there where you just got a place that's just too narrow to get through, and then there's no way beyond that point you would be required to make it accessible. If it's like something is steep and you don't really have to completely regrade the trail, it's just one point where it's going to be 1 to 8 for 10 feet or something, then I think they do have standards that apply to that. In fact, that would be probably one of the sessions that I would like to do for you guys at some point down the road, would be on the recreational areas like paths and things like that, where you're actually outdoor areas that are not facility oriented. You know, one of the things like I talk to people, and this has been all along under the ADA, that if you've got a baseball field, you don't need to make the baseball field accessible, but you do have to have an accessible path to that baseball field. You know, to go out there and take the baseball field and say, we're going to pull out all the grass and we're going to pave this in asphalt so people in wheelchairs can come out here and play baseball, that would be a fundamental alteration in the nature of the game of baseball. Okay? Now, you could have another facility where you had, you know, a separate program that you ran that was like that, but you wouldn't have to do that with all your Little League diamonds within the community. Any other?
I have a quick question. I noticed you didn't include saunas in this presentation.
No.
Are saunas included in the new guidelines you just didn't cover?
Yeah. They basically, your access issues there, they're very much like with swimming pools. There are some particular things there, but I think of those, I sort of thought of those as being an interior built space, but if we're going to do, in fact, I'm anticipating maybe putting up like a modular like training system on our website for each element of recreational facilities at some point. My contact information is here. We did have you guys sign in if you're interested. We do a monthly electronic newsletter, and we don't spam people. We don't put, there's not just a bunch of stuff in there that's irrelevant. Usually there's new information. But we do like to have people on that email list so that we have a new document. We print copies of the new ADA standards. We'll let anybody on that newsletter list will know about it. So that's pretty much everything I needed to tell you today, I think. And just